From Steven Soderbergh and Darren Aronofsky to Martin Scorsese, Terrence Malick, and Chris Nolan, the list of filmmakers who've distinguished themselves as masters of a particular genre or as creators of high-concept films is remarkably short. The list is even shorter if we include only those whose films consistently and consciously attempt to translate complex ideas into film format. Here, Nolan easily tops the list.
Both the film and the short story deal with repetition and internal echoes. And also, they both alternate between the objective and the subjective. So in the screenplay, what I did is I said, I need a way of breaking up the flashbacks so that we separate the scenes in our mind and feel this progression further and further back in time. So what I did is I alternated between these color sequences that are intensely subjective. Everything in the color sequences is from Leonard's point of view. We're always in his head, at least.
If it can be concisely put,
we alternate
as ludicrous a task as it is to understand a Nolan film on first watch, it may be put this way.
A little bit more.
Nolan's movies are themes that reveal the mechanics lying beneath a thick veil of reality. These stories aren't purely fictional, but almost didactic or educational. The fictional elements are rather those things we deem real. The characters, their names, the locations. In Nolan's films, these elements seem expedient, secondary.
It's the first person.
Important as the casting choices are, the locations, the spectacles. In a Nolan film, it's never these that carry the film like most high-budget blockbusters.
Our subjective view of the world, the subjective way in which we have to experience life, and then our faith in an objective reality beyond that. And most movies present a quite comfortable universe where we're given an objective truth that we don't get in everyday life. It's one of the reasons we go to the movies. This film, we didn't want to do that. We didn't want to step outside his head. We wanted to present the audience with that problem effectively and say, he can't ever get outside his head and recognize what the objective truth is.
Concepts like dreams and dream layers, inversion and time dilation when woven into a story seem to magnify rather than distort reality. Inception is a perfect model for this, a story which I think is an eloquently told account of an idea which most of us seem to have absolutely no concept of. Recursion is commonly defined as the process of solving a problem by defining it in terms of a simpler version of itself. Ludicrous, isn't it? Everyone knows that reality, as our own senses blatantly testify, is linear. And although science is fast embracing new frameworks of time, it always seems to put them on the lucid end of the theoretical spectrum as if to balance out those of gravity, evolution, and relativity, designating them to faraway regions of space as far away as possible from the familiar, never considering that those almost fictional temporal frameworks are part and parcel of our own, just layered beneath that which we like to think of as linear, which is just a synonym for normal or familiar. Einstein's relativity unveiled one of perhaps many of these frameworks. His discovery may be likened to those of the people from the Platonic allegory who emerged out of the cave to see reality for what it is. Recursion, often considered a mathematical concept exemplified by something like the Fibonacci sequence, is actually the cornerstone of modern achievements in computer science and technology. As a matter of fact, it is a framework as crucial and revolutionary to this field as Einstein's relativity proved for physics. It's one of those ideas that seem hidden on the surface, or as one would say a good pitch for a movie, or one of those things that you'd see in an Escher painting or a trick image on your social media feed, but on a closer look is shown to be more real than anything. Douglas Hofstadter has a whole chapter on this in his book, Gödel, Escher, and Bach, describes recursion as
stories inside stories, movies inside movies, paintings inside paintings, Russian dolls inside Russian dolls, even parenthetical comments inside parenthetical comments.
These are few of the charms of recursion, he added. Hofstadter's right when he says that sometimes recursion seems to brush paradox very closely. For example, there are recursive definitions. That such a definition may give the casual viewer the impression that something's being defined in terms of itself. That would be circular and lead to infinite regress, if not to paradox proper. This is because a recursive definition, he says, never defines something in terms of itself, but always in terms of simpler versions of itself. This is precisely what's depicted in Inception. The mechanics are entirely built on this. Dreams within are structured in layers. Each successive layer represents a deeper level of the subconscious. Time functions differently in each layer. The deeper the level, the slower the time moves relative to the layer above. 5 minutes in the real world can equate to an hour in the first dream layer, and exponentially more as one goes deeper. The thing is, what we observe in the movie is not exclusive to dreams. Reality is very much structured this way. Events and situations take place within contexts that transcend them, and those contexts within larger contexts, and so on. To understand a particular situation, we usually try to put it into perspective, i.e. search for the context that overarches the situation. Think about it. If you're writing an essay, the words which form the sentence that you write seem immediate and instantaneous. The average typing speed is 55 words per minute. That's a lot of words. The writing process seems instantaneous and immediate by comparison to the essay, in relation to which time appears to move much slower. Now, your typing speed of 50 words per minute, if compared to the relative production speed of an essay or blog, the gap immediately appears as quite large, no matter how exceedingly fast your typing speed is. This law cannot be changed, because the writing process itself that involves those minute transitions from word to word are themselves instantiated by whatever the topic or the object of the writing happens to be. You could write 100 words per minute, but only produce 2 articles a week, or even 1 article depending on the complexity of the subject. If a book, then it may take you 2 chapters a month depending on the length of the book, but then only produce 1 book a year, which is very uncommon for most. Dreams, as depicted by Nolan, especially in the final act of the movie, articulates this. The deeper the characters dove down the layers of a dream architecture, the more unconscious, uncertain, and unpredictable things became. The more unfamiliar the landscape grew, and this is the source from which the biggest challenges that the characters face stem. In the language of Inception, these challenges take an immunological form. Rather than the innocuous, uncharted territory that psychology treats, the unconscious reacts in a hostile way, producing antibodies in the form of projections or dream figures that attack intruders.
Converge on me.
Converge?
They sense the foreign nature of the dreamer. They attack like white blood cells fighting an infection.
Like they're gonna attack us?
No. Just you.
This modification of the unconscious can easily be answered by the law of recursion. The deeper layers, as per Hofstadter's definition, are simpler versions of the upper layers. The simpler something is, the vaguer and less defined it is, which is another way of saying that it's general and, as such, wanting of definition.
Forgive me for wanting a little specificity, Eames. Specificity?
Simplicity is often erroneously confused with easy or finite. But this is where the inclusion of recursion flips the script. Here, the simpler something is, the more varieties it contains, the higher the number of interpretations which it could bear. Occam's razor was specifically sculpted to deal with this problem. In a real-world scenario, this simplicity, which in the movie defines the deeper layers of a dream scenario, are contexts, the variables of which are relatively more numerous than the upper layers, meaning that the things which the characters are to account for in order to pull off their objective successfully are orders of magnitude more numerous and less predictable than those which they've originally drew their mission upon. Thus there will emerge things from the character's viewpoint that will appear entirely arbitrary and paradoxical.
Asshole, how you mess up the carpet?
It wasn't my fault.
You're the architect.
I didn't know he was gonna rub his damn cheek on it.
That's enough. You, what the hell was all that?
I have it under control.
I'd hate to see you out of control.
We don't have time for this.
Usually here the thinking cap, i.e. reason, is dispensed with, and instead notions like divination and intuition, which are comparatively less reasonable and more resistant to proof, are resorted to.
Subconscious is motivated by emotion, right? Not reason. We need to find a way to translate this into an emotional concept.
How do you translate a business strategy into an emotion?
That's what we're...
But this is all relative. It seems here that divination equates to acquaintance with the deeper structures or the wider contexts of things. The wider the scope, and by extension the number of variables involved in any given layer, the more unconscious it is. The narrower, the more conscious. The extraction process requires that the extractor has such a degree of access to the subject's mind as to know the contextual basis of every event. Only here would it be possible to make the unconscious conscious, but this is impossible.
Feel that? You've actually been trained for this, Mr. Fisher. Pay attention to the strangeness of the weather, the shift in gravity. None of this is real. You're in a dream.
Union concepts aren't entirely alien to Nolan films, as we see, among other instances, the concept of union archetypes cited by Scarecrow in Batman Begins. Even the idea that the unconscious can generate projections that are hostile, though experienced by many clinical psychologists, is a uniquely Jungian association. Now add to this dream architecture and location and their significance to the subject. In Inception, the architectonic side of dream landscape is the extractor's main tactical approach, often used to manipulate and stupefy, but not always without error.
You have 2 minutes to design a maze that it takes 1 minute to solve. Stop. Again.
Central to all of this, in fact, the defining element, is the structure of time, as defining an element of the dream landscape as it is of Nolan's filmography, Memento, Interstellar, Tenet, etc. The nonlinear element of time is expressed so concretely that in more than a few instances, it appears in diagrams drawn by characters ahead of some important or final act of the movie, as if to say that the success or failure of the protagonist hinges on how well adapted he is to this notion, which the first 3/4 of the movie spent building up.
Maths was never my strong subject. How much time is that?
It's a week, the first level down. 6 months, the second level down, and the third level.
It's 10 years. Who would want to be stuck in a dream for 10 years?
Depends on the dream.
The experience we get here is so exceptional, inceptional if you will, on the cinematic front that its closest analog is the eureka moment of scientific enlightenment or discovery. The examples here are abundant, and somewhat establish Nolan as a modern filmmaker by contrast to a Ridley Scott. Think of how hyperbolic geometry grew out of Euclidean space, or special relativity from classical mechanics. It's not a coincidence that those two epoch-making events pertain to the notion of time. It captures a similar sentiment to that which Einstein expressed in relation to quantum theory, that the more successful it gets, the sillier it looks. The Einstein-Rosen bridge, Penrose stairs, Escherian objects, experiences which, were they not commonplace in today's science, would have been considered totally psychedelic. But these are essential ingredients to every Nolan film. But what are the real connotations of this, if it's reality that we seek here? In Inception, and to a greater extent Tenet, we're introduced to a geometry of time modeled on the principles of gravity. Einsteinian gravity, if you will. Two objects still attract each other, but the basis for attraction is not magnetic, i.e. based on the physical properties of objects, their mass or density in relation to other objects, but on a little-known concept, which appears in quantum mechanics under the name of quantum retrocausality, which says that events in the future can affect the past. The idea suggests that if an experimenter makes a decision in how to measure a particle in the present, it can affect the particle's state in the past. This notion of time, where future events influence past conditions, could be viewed as a form of dialectical time, where temporal causality is not unidirectional, but bidirectional, or as it's called in Tenet, a temporal tensor. We can approach this question gradually, and in a way which the strong empiricist leanings of modern science would usually have us miss. If a subject, say the protagonist from Tenet, could, by merely lifting his hand to catch the bullet on the table, on the pretense that he dropped it, then, insofar as the relation is one between two external things, nothing is strange apart from the retrocausal mechanism. But there is a more nuanced relation here that's inaccessible to empirical science. What actuates the subject himself? What explains that will with which he is able to lift his hand in the direction of the bullet in the first place? It would seem as if by this question, we're invoking the still unsolved and by consensus unsoluble last 2,000 years of philosophical discourse on the nature of the soul and free will. But this isn't the case. On reflection, the postulate of retrocausality, as it appears in quantum mechanics, is self-evident with the right approach. This is where one can draw upon the significance of totems in Inception. Cobb's top, Arthur's loaded die, Ariadne's chess piece all hint at this.
Take a look. So you're learning, huh?
An elegant solution for keeping track of reality.
This concept, I believe, can only be understood through the distinction between the self and the ego.
And then behind those two things, behind the shadow and the anima and the animus, there's a final archetype, which is the archetype of the self. And that's, Jung believed that the self was what you were as a totality. And that's a hard thing to understand, but you could think about it this way. You could think about the self as the total of what you are now, plus the total of all those things that you could still be. So it would be you as a reality, plus you as potential. And that's a strange idea, right? Because we don't really know how to understand the idea of potential as modern empirical people, because potential, virtually by definition, is not yet manifest, and also not a straightforward thing to either measure or conceptualize. By the same token, everybody acts as if they have potential.
The self here is conceptualized as the totality of the psyche. It's the central archetype that serves as the repository and organizing principle for the entire personality. It represents the potential of the person. It is, in the proper sense, that which actuates the person. In a sense, the person is not an accident of the time and place, but comes into the world already equipped with a range of aptitudes that define his or her personality exclusively, that makes him as unique cognitively as his genes makes him unique physically. This mental anatomy is as intricate as the physical. It's not a web of organs or a network of blood vessels and nerves, but cognitive architectures. Engrams, complexes, archetypes, and other formations which animate the cognitive side of being, and by extension the physical. They are that teeming landscape that seem a pale and confused copy of reality, is where reality itself is rooted, since these are the same structures, i.e. cognitive functions, through which we form the world without. These cognitive structures are more than the half-fantastic, half-psychedelic things which we often think them, but meaningful structures, mechanics, formulae, schematics, equations that are the physics of the dream world, i.e. the mind's infrastructure. Now, on the analogy between the mental and physiological domains, if it can be said that the body's purpose, all its intricate and infinite array of functions and connections, exists solely for the purpose of allowing me to move, then could this not be extended, perhaps, to the mental sphere? Are not the functions of the mind, the patterns of reasoning, judgment, dreams, reflections, memory, and all the cognitive infrastructure that lay beneath them, likewise exists to allow me to perform an act as simple as that which my body allows, with, say, my hand? And is not the fact that we're able to perform mental tasks at all imply that these mental processes have certain arrangements? Inception's dream engineering drops us right in the middle of this, and shows us, through the eyes of Ariadne's, a theoretical perspective.
When we're asleep, our mind can do almost anything.
Such as?
Well, imagine you're designing a building, right? You consciously create each aspect. But sometimes it feels like it's almost creating itself, if you know what I mean.
Yeah, like I'm discovering it.
Genuine inspiration, right? Now, in a dream, our mind continuously does this. We create and perceive our world simultaneously, and our mind does this so well that we don't even know what's happening. That allows us to get right in the middle of that process.
How?
By taking over the creating part. Now, this is where I need you.
What allows me to function, to move my hand, to have thoughts, seems to be that larger self, of which movement, mental or physical, is an instantiation. A whole system as it takes hold in a moment. And a mere moment could not possibly exhaust this whole, but only serve as instances or cases thereof. This pattern is all too common. Self-preservation, for example, on either the individual or the species level. The action of any member of a species is predetermined by, and is always for the sake of the species at large, even where the action is blatantly self-serving and seemingly at the expense of the group. And so the self stands above the subject as the genus does the member. The self transcends the subject. It is a world, or rather the world from the perspective of the subject. He's macrocosm, a world to be assembled, charted, conquered, developed. Inception brings this idea into full expression by allowing the subject to indwell his own mind through dreams, and thereby depicting a truth that in reality, were it not for dreams, would remain totally hidden from us. The self, like the species, is a complete thing, a sort of program. In acting, the subject represents it, and what he represents, or tries to represent, to be exact, is the self in its totality or eternity. Thus, it's not a coincidence that although it's a world in itself, we always treat it as an individual thing. This is because individuation is a perfected state, and it's by this perfection that individuation is possible. This goes back to Cobb's explanation of dream mechanics to Ariadne's, specifically where he says that the mind simultaneously creates and perceives this world, and does it so well that we don't even know it's happening. This is the movie's way of explaining individuation. Though different from each other, perfection and identity are here synonymous. Individuation links these two together in such a way that the difference is indeed almost non-existent. If depicted in time, this interrelation would not be an object at all. Much like how we're not aware of our heartbeat, of the rhythms of systole and diastole until something happens to the heart that brings our attention to it. It's because under normal circumstances, the heart functions as it should, and as such frees up a margin of energy for the body to perform other tasks and for the mind to think about things that have nothing to do with the heart. This is what Cobb explains in the scene. Well explained, though the basic idea is, it's only properly fleshed out in Tenet, which many argue is similar to Inception. It's similar in this respect. The mechanics of the world of Tenet allows us to think of the inverted version of the person as the self, and the non-inverted as the ego. The same recreative process that Cobb explains in Inception is the whole point of Tenet, the law by which its universe operates.
What's happened's happened, which is an expression of faith in the mechanics of the world. It's not an excuse to do nothing.
Fate?
Call it what you want.
What do you call it?
Reality. Now let me go.
What's noteworthy here is the addition of the future. Future acts influence the present as much as the present the future. The dynamic relation between the self and the ego is most eloquently expressed here. The self is analogous to the future, i.e. the inverted version, and it warrants this position because it can't be fully realized in the present due to its vastness. And since it's complete, it can only be represented in a temporal sequence as lying somewhere in the future, standing above the ego, as its potential, as what's being approximated. Unlike Jung, Leibniz calls the self the individual substance. Also unlike Jung, Leibniz speaks in the language of metaphysics, where the so-called ego, which the model of psychology interprets as an extension of the self, appears here as the self's momentary actions. We can say, he says, that the nature of an individual substance, or of a complete being, is to have a notion so complete that it is sufficient to contain and to allow us to deduce from it all the predicates of the subject to which this notion is attributed. An accident, which in Jungian psychology plays the role of the ego in his explanation, is a being whose notion does not include everything that can be attributed to the subject to which the notion is attributed.
Thus, Alexander the Great's kinghood is an abstraction from the subject, leaving out much detail, and so is not determinate enough to pick out an individual, and doesn't involve the other qualities of Alexander or everything that the notion of that prince includes, whereas God, who sees the individual notion or thisness of Alexander, sees in it at the same time the basis and the reason for all the predicates that can truly be said to belong to him, such as, for example, that he would conquer Darius and Porus, even to the extent of knowing a priori, and not by experience, whether he died a natural death or by poison, which we can know only from history. Furthermore, if we bear in mind the interconnectedness of things, we can say that Alexander's soul contains for all time traces of everything that did and signs of everything that will happen to him, and even marks of everything that happens in the universe, although it is only God who can recognize them all.
Thus, whether it's tenet with inversion or inception with recursion, the underlying idea is the same, only approached from two different angles. In inception, it's the ascendancy of the self that's expressed, its depth, its prowess, its scale, and in tenet, its time-defying nature, its relation to the present, to the real world, showing us how it can bend reality as equally as it does dreams.